Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I thought you were going to talk about how to increase cost. That's also an interesting topic for a presentation. Yeah, but we more or less all said red, and I think that's true. Let's dive a bit into the topic of modulating gut health. What I would like to go through is a bit of the general topics related to this, and in the first speech primarily you have seen a lot of topics related to gut health. Dive into the alternatives to antibiotics. I've seen a big change in the dynamics around the topic. I've worked a lot in Northwestern Europe in the last years, and well, some people even start to get a bit tired of the topic. Well, if you now travel outside in Asian countries, Latin America, this is really starting to kick off, and I think it's one of the biggest things that is happening to our industry actually today. I'll zoom in a bit more on butyric acid later on as a very crucial molecule to optimize gut health. In the end, what we try to do is to balance the different actors that play a role in what we call gut health. And we've seen different drawings of the same picture with 3 or 4 or 5 parameters, but it's the gut wall itself, the immune system, the flora, the feed that we put in there, that all need to be balanced out in an optimal way. Now, we had a good tool to do that, antibiotics, to help us keep that balance. And I'm sure you're all aware that wherever we look, we see more and more input of that we really need to find alternatives. When I went to vet school and got out of there around 10 years ago, so you can see in the list where we ended up there, gut health was not a topic. We were taught specific diseases. We were taught when to use which type of antibiotics. And yeah, we were taught that we should be careful which type to select. But talking about dysbiosis as a complex disease or working with tools to optimize gut health in a general way was not a topic. And that is reflected if you look at publications around gut health. So just a search on gut health delivers these results. It didn't exist before 2000 in literature. It was not a topic as such. And you see, if you put next to that the trend in scientific publications related to antibiotic resistance, that those two increase at a similar trend. That is what is in focus today. Now, what type of alternatives, if we talk about antibiotics, are then in focus? I've done the same, and I've looked in 2 scientific databases, the Google Scholar and the PubMed database. What type of alternatives are most in focus and are most published about? And you can see the 2 lists. In the Google search, I compared the years 2004 to 6 with 2014 until today. You see it's more or less increased with a 10-fold for the different topics. And very clearly work on prebiotics, probiotics, butyric acids or butyrates, and essential oils. They stand out in all the searches in the different databases. Medium chain fatty acids, acidifiers, and some other alternatives are really way back behind those top 4. Is that because they are the best, or is that because there's a more commercial push focusing on those different solutions? That's, of course, something we can debate. But if you look in, and I took the latest gut health special of World Poultry, what topics are described there, it's the same list. That is where our community is focusing on, the scientific community is focusing on to find right solutions. This is a overview of alternatives to antibiotics, produced by US scientists, not only looking at additives to replace antibiotics, but also at management factors that can play a role here. And they listed them in terms of how effective are they today, and what type of potential do we foresee in the future, and what type of role can they play. And you can clearly say that they were much more optimistic when you look at potential impact, when we look at the management tools, than when it comes to existing feed additive concepts, with a couple of exceptions. There is one thing that at least I missed in this list, because if we speak about organic acids, still the traditional reflex is to think about acidifiers, acids as such, which work in broilers on crop stomach level, and that's it. And the whole trend of the last couple of years working with protected acids, short chain, medium chain, coated, esterified forms, that's a relatively new domain which gives us new opportunities to modulate gut health. So we're going from the traditional acidifiers, and I think in the swine industry that is much more common than in poultry industry. The principle is the same, reduce pathogenic load with using antibacterial alternatives to antibiotics. And it's effective, but when we look at what is in focus, that's really tools to try to have a direct influence on intestinal health, bringing solutions where we need them to play a role. And what they have in common is that they are in a way all linked to one specific molecule, which is butyric acid. In a direct or in an indirect way, they influence the production of butyric acid in the gut. I think one of the breakthrough papers published was this paper by the group of Professor van Immerzeel in Ghent, looking at protected butyric acid in a salmonella model, trying to find which type of short-chain fatty acids might play a role if it's brought in the animal in a protected form in reducing salmonella counts in the cecum. Around this time, those type of products entered the market, and they are now one of the key alternatives that are used to combat different problems. In very short, what they did, they took 1 carbon until 4 carbon short-chain fatty acids, so formic until butyric. They all coated them and fed them to animals. What you can see is the contamination levels in the different colors. So the further right, the higher the contamination levels in the ceca. And you can clearly see that actually formic acid and acetic acid made the situation worse, while propionic acid and butyric acid improved the situation. And that's interesting, because that was something that we never really thought about before. But if you look at how we function, and we produce a lot of short-chain fatty acids in our colon, the key drivers for, let's say, a positive gut health are propionic and butyric acid. And the one that is associated with a negative gut health, if we look at Crohn's disease, for instance, is acetic acid. So in a way, it makes sense what the results of this paper was. So butyrate is a key regulator in gut health. And we are very lucky that this is a hot topic in human medicine as well. So a lot of the ideas and a lot of the principles we learn by looking at literature produced on the human side. And they are mainly focusing on colon issues, inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, colon tumors, and try to find ways how butyrates can play a role there, either directly or via the probiotic route. So the big difference compared to, let's say, 10, 12 years ago is that we don't consider this acid to be an acidifier. It's a regulator of gut health. It's not the antibacterial power of this molecule that we like to use. It's the steering mechanism of several cellular processes, inflammatory processes that are related to villi development, disjunction strength, etc. So it's a completely different dynamics than the traditional way of looking at acidifiers. What is also intriguing, and we're trying to learn more about that, is if you work with solutions like this, where then do you want them to end up? Is the site of delivery really important or not? In traditional medicine, if you work in a pharmaceutical company, you really try to focus that your molecule ends up at the place where it needs to have an effect. And what we are learning over time is that that might be different for butyric acid. This is one example that I would like to use to emphasize this. This is a study done in lab animals. It was with humans in mind, and it's a salmonella challenge model, where they infected the animals with where they used antibiotics in animals to change the situation on gut level. So in the end, Salmonella was able to create an infection there. And what they then did was looked at, okay, so what is changing now? We see that Clostridia are disappearing because of the changing environment. We see a reduction in butyrate production in the colon. So we will administer butyric acid in the form of butyrines to see if we can change that situation. And they did. But not because the butyrines supplemented orally ended up at this site. So we see effects throughout the intestinal tract without bringing a molecule at that specific site. And the big question is now, how does it exactly function? How is that communication chain throughout the intestinal tract exactly functioning? And there's a lot of different receptors and hormonal pathways that we're understanding more and more of. But that's quite a fascinating domain. So butyrate we know for, let's say, 30 years. Started in ruminants, actually, where we found out it has very positive effects on rumen development. And throughout the 90s, it was more and more studied in swine and poultry models. It really kicked off when we started to coat them. And the big problem with butyric acid, and actually with a lot of organic acids, is the smell. It's terrible to work with. You don't want your workers to work with it in feed production. So that made a big change. The latest developments now is to go for an uncoated but protected version, and that is not to use fat as an outer coating, but to turn the acid into a fat by using a glycerol backbone. And we see that with butyric acid. We also see that with some medium-chain fatty acids, that it's not using a lot of waste product basically to protect the molecules, but to turn it into a triglyceride. If we look at the effects in animals and we compare all kinds of solutions, it all comes down to how much butyric acid do you bring inside an animal. And then the specific technique as such has not proven to make any difference. So it's really looking, okay, what is the concentration that I'm able to bring past the stomach to have its effect? And then what effects it will have, that's quite variable depending on the circumstances. It's steering gut health. But if that gut health is optimal, and we can create optimal situations in R&D situations, the effect is not there. There is no improvement. If you dose a huge amount of this molecule, it also won't have a negative effect, because it will balance itself out as a regulator molecule. We have looked at development of villi. We have looked at microflora composition. And on all these levels, we see that same trend, that once there is something to improve because of outer challenges, the effects are there. Necrotic enteritis, we've learned a bit more about it this morning, and general dysbiosis. I think it's a popular model still to use, also for us, since it's well described. There are several models in the world that are quite reliable to use, and that's why we also have looked at a necrotic enteritis challenge in relation to butyric acid, and also in relation to antibiotics. And I see that the different groups' explanation are missing here in the slide, but when we use higher levels of challenge in different models with Clostridia, we see that the impact that butyrate can have increases. What I really would like to understand is which of the different effects that butyrates have is now really the most important one. And this is quite a traditional slide, so a couple of years ago published, slightly modified with a lot of the effects that are proven that butyrates can have in the intestinal tract. Which of them will result in the significant improvement of performance? That's not really known and very difficult to find out. What we do know is that the effect on, let's say, the quality of the gut wall, when we look at tight junctions, when we look at enterocyte proliferation, next to that, the role that it has on the immune system, in combination with regulating the flora composition, is a very powerful way to steer gut health in the right direction. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Geert, for steering us in the right direction, even if there are still some questions on research. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
You showed a trial on necrotic arthritis challenge.
Yes.
Do you have any details of the challenge that was used in the trial?
In this one, yes. This was done in Atlanta, in the US, with Professor Hoffaker. He uses a model which is, well, quite, let's say, heavy, with, I think it's 3 days in a row, a very high infection of Clostridia. The risk with that model is that you will have a very high mortality rate, and that, of course, influences a lot of other parameters that you measure at the same time as well. In this time, it was not that severe. A more, I would say, repeatable model is the one that they use in Ghent University, where we also have done several trials. They work with an overdose in coccidia vaccines, some changes in the diet, some, I think, fish meal they use, and then also later on a challenge with Clostridia. But they aim for lesions, not for mortality. So the mortality levels are not significantly different in that case. You have several models around the world that use their own specifics. Yeah.
Another question from the audience, maybe?
I have a question in regard to the tree butyrate, because as I understand, you have a backbone of a glycine and 3 butyrates, right? So the animal, or inside the animal, it might just turn into a B and then a mono.
That's correct.
Is it always like actually a mix? Because in literature you find a different effect between mono, D and 3. What explains that effect, the difference in that effect?
What explains the different outcome for the animal? What kind of source you use, you mean? Yeah, that is a good question. A big difference is that the concentration of active molecules is different. If you look in literature, real literature, or the let's say public available information, the focus is really on the molecules as such, and mainly on the butyrate part, the mono part, and what roles it plays in this disc compared to butyric acid is really unknown. We believe that the effects will be quite similar to a separate butyrate molecule. But a lot of more work on the mono component as such is needed to explore that. If you compare it on an equal dose level, and look for performance, then the tributylene is proven to be a more effective molecule. If you would say, well, let's increase the dose and look on butyric acid equivalence, then the question if that's still the same. Maybe then they are equal, but then you come into a cost effect, because you increase the price a lot as well. Yeah.
Thank you. I have another question from the web. And it says, why should I choose butyric acid instead of probiotics?
Yeah, I'm not saying you should, and it depends on the situation. I think in swine probiotics or in piglets probiotics have proven themselves quite well. In poultry, I think that the results are relatively variable, so they can have really good impacts, but sometimes also not so much. So let's say if you want to compare them, then I think that butyrate gives a more constant effect, if you compare to probiotics. Yeah.
And when it comes to the fight against salmonella, do you see coated acids being common or quite novel, and what's the future around that?
Yeah. Yeah, with Salmonella, the aim is to get rid of it at all, and no product can do that. The successful cases that we know of, they have used protected acids in very high dose levels. So to keep on doing that for a long time is economically not interesting. So with the tools that we have today, I don't think we will be able to solve Salmonella. But you have seen, I've showed 2 examples of Salmonella. There is evidence that the molecules are effective. If we look at what happens in practice, I don't believe it's good enough.
It's not the silver bullet.
No, maybe bronze or, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Geert. A hand of applause for Geert. Thank you.